My brothers and sisters, when we talk about war and retaliation, we often imagine numbers, weapons, technology, and strategies. But very rarely do we speak about the shockwaves that ripple through the world when a nation that was expected to bow down suddenly stands up with dignity and might. This is what happened when Iran retaliated in a way far greater than the world had anticipated. You see, many people had assumed that Iran would respond with caution, perhaps a symbolic gesture, maybe even silence. Because after all, who dares challenge the giants of our time? Who dares strike back when the entire world order seems to lean in one direction? But that assumption, my beloved brothers and sisters, was rooted in arrogance. It was rooted in a blindness that comes from thinking that might alone defines victory. Iran's retaliation wasn't just about missiles and targets. It wasn't only about infrastructure or defense systems. No, it was psychological. It struck at the pride of those who believed they were untouchable. It challenged the narrative of superiority, and more than anything else, it shook the thrones of leaders who had grown too comfortable in their dominance. This is where the human heart begins to panic, because what truly terrifies the powerful is not the known enemy, it is the unpredictable one, the unexpected one, the one who does not fear death, the one who carries a purpose greater than survival. That kind of opponent is dangerous, not because of his weapons, but because of his conviction. And conviction, my brothers and sisters, is a weapon no intelligence agency can detect, and no missile defense system can intercept. When the news of Iran's response broke, we saw the reactions. Not just in the military corridors, but on the faces of commentators, advisors, and heads of state. There was a shift in tone. Suddenly, the confidence vanished. Words like de-escalation, dialogue, and containment began to appear. The same voices that had just days earlier called for action and dominance were now calling for wisdom and peace. Why? Because the retaliation revealed something profound. Iran was not responding as a victim, but as a player, no longer silent under pressure, but bold in its reply. It did not react in anger, but retaliated with calculation. Every missile, every drone, every announcement was a message not only to its enemy, but to the world. A message that said, we may not have your wealth, we may not have your alliances, but we have something you cannot understand. We have patience, we have identity, and we are not afraid. Think about that for a moment. Isn't that what we see in the great stories of faith? That the one who has tawakkul, trust in Allah, deep within, is often the one who stands firm even when the world expects them to fall. Isn't that the story of David and Goliath, of Musa before Pharaoh, of the Prophet Muhammad in the caves of persecution? And when people are surprised by the strength of the underdog, it's because they measure strength by material means. They look at guns, tanks, aircraft carriers, but they ignore the strength that comes from belief. They underestimate the power of a wounded soul that refuses to be humiliated. Iran's retaliation reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful act is to simply not break, not to beg, not to retreat, but to rise at the moment they thought you couldn't. That is the moment of awakening, and that is why panic spread. Not because the world suddenly feared Iran's missiles, but because they realized Iran had crossed a psychological line, the line of submission. Let me ask you, my brothers and sisters, how often in our personal lives do we face similar moments? Moments where people expect us to stay quiet, to stay broken, to stay beneath them? And what happens when we finally say, enough? The moment you rise, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, watch how the people who underestimated you begin to feel shaken. It's not because you became violent, it's because you became free. And freedom terrifies those who thrive on control. So this retaliation, bigger than expected, was not just a geopolitical event. It was a human event. a spiritual event. It showed the world that you can only push a people so far before they push back. And when they do, their response will not only be bigger, it will be deeper. It will carry years of pain, of pressure, of prayer. And when that kind of force is unleashed, it's not just felt on the battlefield, it's felt in the hearts of those who never thought they'd have to answer for what they had done. That, my brothers and sisters, is the moment when the mighty begin to tremble, not from force, but from truth. And truth, as Allah tells us, always prevails, even if the world conspires against it. So reflect on this. Strength does not come from size, but from sincerity. And fear does not arise from weakness, but from awakening. When a soul awakens, a nation awakens. And when a nation awakens, the world watches in panic. My beloved brothers and sisters, sometimes the true test of strength is not found on the battlefield, but in how the powerful react when their confidence is suddenly shattered. When Iran responded in a way that surpassed all expectations, the world did not just witness explosions, it witnessed a collapse of assumptions, a breakdown of the illusion that power, when unchecked, is eternal. You see, the panic we saw among world leaders wasn't just about the damage inflicted. It was about what that damage represented. It was a reminder, loud and clear, that the systems they had built, the hierarchies they had trusted, were not as invincible as they once believed. And this, my brothers and sisters, is one of the greatest fears of any empire. The fear that the underdog they look down upon might rise in a moment of courage and clarity. Power, as we know, is fragile when it is based on pride. That is why the Quran reminds us again and again that arrogance is the disease of those who think they are above accountability. Fir'aun had power, Namrud had power, yet what broke them wasn't a greater army. It was the realization that their pride had blinded them. Their downfall began the moment they believed they were untouchable. What we saw in this retaliation was that very same fear manifesting in the modern halls of leadership. The reactions were not of control, they were of confusion. The world's most powerful nations found themselves scrambling to respond to something they didn't anticipate, and that, in itself, is a kind of defeat. But let's pause and ask, why was the retaliation so unexpected? Why did they assume Iran would respond with hesitation or restraint? It's because the modern world often equates material superiority with moral superiority. Yes, it is. It is a question that many Muslims feel equally anxious to answer. It assumes that those who possess less will always obey those who possess more. That those under sanctions, pressure, or isolation will always fold. But history, and more importantly, our DNA, teaches us the opposite. Allah tells us in the Quran, "Do not think Allah is unaware of what the oppressors do. He only delays them for a day, when eyes will stare in horror." Surah Abraham 42. Subhanallah, there is always a moment when the oppressed rise. And when they do, the powerful remember that they are not gods, they are human. And they too can bleed. They too can panic. This is what happened when Iran retaliated with full force. The so-called superpowers were not afraid of Iran's military alone. They were afraid of the implications. That maybe, just maybe, other nations who have been bullied, silenced, and sanctioned will now start to believe that they too can stand up, that resistance is possible, that justice, when pursued with courage and clarity, cannot be indefinitely silenced. And so the fear spread, not only in military bases, but in political offices and diplomatic circles, because power feeds on predictability. It thrives when others act as expected. But the moment someone breaks the mold, the entire system starts to question itself. Do you understand how deep that is, my brothers and sisters? This wasn't about missiles, it was about mindset. The retaliation broke a psychological barrier. It challenged the monopoly on fear, and suddenly the narrative changed. Suddenly, the powerful were reminded that their power is not divine. It is not eternal, it is borrowed, and it can be questioned. There's something else that's worth reflecting on. After the retaliation, notice how the conversations among leaders shifted. Some began speaking about restraint. Others called for dialogue and peace. Subhanallah, these are the same leaders who just days earlier were threatening destruction and dominance. So what changed? What changed was not their principles, it was their perception of vulnerability. They realized that retaliation brings consequences, that fire, when spread, does not remain contained. It affects both the oppressed and the oppressor. That's when fear becomes real. Not when one side suffers, but when both sides realize they have something to lose. This is why our Deen teaches us humility in leadership. The Prophet Muhammad was the most powerful man in Arabia, yet he never abused his power. He never acted in arrogance. Why? Because he understood that true strength is not in domination. It is in restraint guided by wisdom. It is in remembering that all power ultimately belongs to Allah. So now, as we witness this global panic, we must understand the deeper lesson. That fear does not always come from weakness. Sometimes fear comes from truth. And truth is terrifying to those who have built their empires on deception, on coercion, and on the suffering of others. When Iran retaliated, it forced the world to see a reality they were trying to avoid. That no nation, no matter how isolated, is powerless when it chooses to rise with conviction. And no empire, no matter how powerful, is safe when it is built on oppression. So what can we learn from all of this, my dear brothers and sisters? We learn that the arrogance of power is its own weakness, and the patience of the oppressed is its own strength. The mighty fear the unexpected because they know that deep down their thrones are fragile. And when truth knocks on the door of pride, even the strongest hands begin to tremble. Never underestimate the one who has nothing to lose but everything to defend. And never overestimate the one who appears powerful but is governed by fear. Because in the end, it is not the size of the army that wins. It is the purity of the purpose. My beloved brothers and sisters, we must understand something very important. Retaliation, especially on the scale we witnessed from Iran, is never random. It is never simply rage dressed in the uniform of military action. What we saw was not chaos. It was calculated. It was strategic. But above all, it was rooted in something far deeper than political interest or even national pride. It was rooted in mindset, in spirit, in resilience. You see, the world often looks at such acts through the narrow lens of weapons and tactics. They analyze the timing, the range of the missiles, the targets, the casualties. But they rarely ask the most important question. What kind of mindset drives a nation to stand its ground against overwhelming odds? What gives a people the ability to face sanctions, threats, isolation, and still strike back? Not from recklessness, but from resolve. That, my dear brothers and sisters, is where the real power lies. Not in machinery, but in the human spirit. In the unwavering belief that standing for dignity is more honorable than surviving in humiliation. The retaliation we witnessed from Iran was born not only from strategy, but from a deep generational endurance. A collective memory of being cornered, criticized, provoked, and punished. And yet, they waited. They absorbed the pressure. And then, at a time of their choosing, not dictated by panic, they responded with precision. That is not a reaction born of hatred. That is a mindset born of discipline. It is very easy to explode in rage. Any nation can do that. Any person can do that. But to remain composed in the face of aggression, to choose your moment with care, to strike with wisdom instead of impulse, that is the mark of a people who are not just surviving, but thinking. And when the world saw that kind of retaliation, it wasn't just the missiles that sent a message. It was the restraint before the missiles. That was what unsettled global leadership. Because they expected desperation, what they received was deliberation. Now ask yourself, where does that level of patience and endurance come from? Is it simply national policy? Is it a clever government? No, it's deeper than that. It comes from a people who are spiritually trained to endure hardship, who see suffering not as a curse, but as a test, who believe that trials come with purpose, and that victory is not always measured by what you gain, but by what you refuse to surrender. When a nation sees itself not only as a political entity, but as a spiritual body, then its actions are no longer random. They become rooted in legacy, in principle, in something higher than public opinion or international approval. And this is what terrifies the modern world the most. A people who don't fear being misunderstood because they are answering to something greater than man. You see, when we look at Iran's retaliation, many will interpret it as military defiance. But I urge you to look deeper. What we witnessed was a spiritual statement, a declaration that says, we will not be broken. We will not respond out of panic. We will respond with purpose, because we are not defined by your approval. We are defined by our own self-respect. That level of self-definition only comes when a people are spiritually awake, when they have reconnected with a sense of identity that is not handed to them by the global powers, but inherited from their own soil, their own sacrifices, and above all their faith. And I want to say something here that we all must reflect on. Those who are spiritually anchored cannot be easily manipulated. They don't fall for every narrative. They don't jump at every provocation. Because they see beyond the immediate. They understand that sometimes silence is louder than shouting, and sometimes patience is stronger than power. That is why when Iran responded, it shocked the world, not because it had weapons, but because it had wisdom. It wasn't just an act of war. It was a masterclass in restraint, timing, and psychological clarity. That is what true strength looks like. It is not loud. It is not boastful. It is focused. It is rooted in the awareness that dignity is not a slogan. It's a responsibility. Now let's turn inward for a moment. Each of us has experienced moments where we are pushed, provoked, cornered. And in those moments we are told to act quickly, to prove our worth, to fight back. But what if real strength is not about how fast you react, but how wisely? What if your greatest power is your ability to pause, to think, to act from principle rather than emotion? This is what we must learn. Because in a world that glorifies loud reactions and viral outrage, it takes real courage to act with silence, strategy, and sincerity. That is not weakness, that is leadership. So what we saw in Iran's retaliation was not only geopolitics, it was a spiritual case study. It was a people saying, we will respond, but not like animals, like human beings, like those who know who they are and who they answer to. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the true source of fear for the modern pharaohs. Not the missiles, but the mindset behind them. A mindset that cannot be colonized, that cannot be bought, that cannot be broken. So remember this, the strongest strike is not the one made in anger, but the one made in awareness. And the most dangerous soul is not the one with weapons, but the one with clarity, faith, and discipline. That may Allah grant us all that mindset. My beloved brothers and sisters, when the dust of retaliation settled and the world stood in disbelief at Iran's unexpected response, something began to unravel. Something many didn't notice immediately, but its effects were deeply felt. It was not just about military targets being hit or headlines flashing across global news. No, what truly began to crumble, quietly and swiftly, was the carefully maintained image of global diplomacy, the system that the world relies on to bring calm, direction, and negotiation. It began to fracture. And that fracture revealed a weakness that no weapon could ever expose. Within hours of Iran's retaliation, emergency meetings were called. World leaders scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Statements were rushed. Language became cautious. You could feel the uncertainty, not just in the words being spoken, but in the silence that surrounded them. That silence, my brothers and sisters, was the sound of confusion at the top. And confusion, when it strikes the powerful, spreads faster than fear among the weak. You see, diplomacy is like a glass mirror. It looks smooth and reflective on the surface, but it's fragile. It shatters the moment it's struck with force it cannot anticipate. Iran's retaliation was that force. Not because it was the deadliest strike in history, but because it was unaccounted for. It came from a place that the international community had conveniently dismissed for too long. They expected negotiation, compromise, perhaps even quiet surrender. But instead, they received firm resolve. And resolve is not something you negotiate with. World leaders who had grown used to calling emergency sessions for others suddenly found themselves on the defensive. They were not dictating terms anymore. They were responding to events they could no longer control. That's the panic no one wants to talk about. The panic of losing the script. And this leads us to a deeper reflection. Why is it that when a Western power strikes, the world calls it defense, but when a nation like Iran strikes back, it is called aggression? Why do we see such double standards in global politics? Why are some acts of war sanitized and others demonized? This, my dear brothers and sisters, is the moral bankruptcy of many modern diplomatic institutions. They claim neutrality, but they serve narratives. They speak of peace, but they prepare for war. They issue statements of balance while tipping the scales in one direction. And when their systems are challenged, when someone they underestimated strikes back, the entire diplomatic machinery begins to panic. Not because the world has changed overnight, but because the illusion of control has been shattered. There's a profound lesson here for all of us. When power is used to dominate rather than serve, when diplomacy is built on manipulation rather than truth, it loses its legitimacy. The world watched as allies tried to contain the fallout, sending messages behind closed doors, offering backdoor deals, urging for calm not out of wisdom, but out of fear that the situation might spiral out of their hands. And this fear was justified. Because for the first time in a long time, it wasn't just Iran being questioned. It was the global system itself. People began to ask, where was the United Nations before the escalation? Where were the peace calls when provocations were being made? Why is justice always delayed until someone strikes back? These are uncomfortable questions, and that's why they're rarely asked. But moments like this force the world to confront the imbalance it has long ignored. When retaliation exposes hypocrisy, it also exposes the fragility of so-called order. Yet amidst all this, there was something even more striking. The way ordinary people around the world responded. While politicians hesitated, the people saw clearly. They saw the injustice. They saw the courage of a nation choosing to reply with dignity. And in that moment, millions of hearts silently shifted, not out of love for conflict, but out of love for justice, for balance, for standing up. This is the power of truth. It doesn't always roar in parliaments or echo in newsrooms. Sometimes it appears in the stillness of conscience, in that deep human knowing that says, what just happened was right, even if the world can't admit it. So, my brothers and sisters, don't be disheartened by the chaos of diplomacy. Sometimes what looks like the collapse of systems is actually the exposure of their flaws. Sometimes a shakeup is needed to bring about clarity. And sometimes one bold stand of defiance does more to awaken the world than 1,000 negotiations ever could. And here's what I leave you with. When the powerful lose control, the sincere must not lose clarity. The world doesn't need more clever diplomats. It needs more truthful ones. People who fear God more than they fear headlines. People who represent the oppressed before they impress the powerful. That's where real leadership begins. Not in polished speeches, but in principled stands. So let us not be fooled by the panic of leaders or the silence of institutions. The world has just seen what courage looks like when diplomacy fails, and when truth steps in. Falsehood, no matter how official, must crumble.